There is a number I want you to think about before this story goes anywhere else.
85,000.
That is how many people flooded the Roland Garros ticketing system within minutes of it going live for the 2026 French Open. Not over the course of a day.
Not across a morning.
Within minutes. The servers buckled.
The website crashed.
The waiting list, a system designed to handle a few thousand names in an orderly queue, swelled so fast that the engineers monitoring it couldn't quite believe what they were looking at. And here is the part that makes this number genuinely extraordinary. This was not a dispersed global rush driven by general tennis enthusiasm. The connection requests were concentrated. IP addresses flooding in from the Philippines, from Filipino communities across the United States and Canada, from the UK, from Australia, from every corner of Europe where members of the Filipino diaspora had settled and built lives and were now, apparently, trying to get to Paris. The French Open organizers had been doing this for a long time. They had managed demand for Federer in his prime, for Nadal on his home clay surface, for Serena Williams in the years when she was the most dominant force women's tennis had ever produced. They had thought they understood what extraordinary demand looked like.
They did not.
Because none of those players had ever crashed their ticketing system in the first few minutes. None of them had generated secondary market prices for a first-round match that exceeded the cost of tickets to the men's final. None of them had caused an emergency meeting in the administrative offices of Roland Garros where tournament officials sat around a table with spreadsheets and anxious expressions trying to figure out what to do about something they had never prepared a contingency plan for. The player responsible for all of this was 20 years old. She had never won a WTA title. Her world ranking was 38. And her name was Alex. Let me slow this down a little because the full picture here is richer and stranger and more moving than the headline numbers suggest, and I don't want to rush past any of it. The Chanel story is where I want to start, because it is the detail that most clearly illustrates the scale of what Alex has become in the months leading up to this tournament. Elaine Wertheimer is 85 years old. He is the billionaire who took ownership of Chanel and built it into a $15 billion empire. He has dressed royalty, pop stars, film icons, the kind of figures whose faces define entire eras of global culture. And in all his decades of running that empire, he had never once personally reached out to an athlete with a sponsorship offer.
Not once.
His brother Gerard handled the commercial relationships. His executives managed the partnerships. Wertheimer himself operated in a particular kind of rarefied shadow, present in the results but absent from the publicity. The brand spoke.
He didn't need to.
And then the French Open released its 2026 player list, and something shifted in a man who had spent 60 years watching trends arrive and disappear and had learned, through all of that watching, to recognize the difference between a moment and a movement.
He picked up the phone.
The offer he put together was $45 million over 5 years.
A signature collection. A global campaign.
The face of Chanel's brand new athletic division. And the condition attached to it was that Alex had to give her answer before she stepped onto the clay at Roland Garros. Not after a strong result. Not after a deep run in the draw.
Before.
The tennis world had a lot of questions about that condition when the story eventually got out. How do you justify $45 million for a player who hasn't won a Grand Slam? How do you build a luxury brand campaign around someone ranked 38th in the world? What exactly does the House of Chanel see in a 20-year-old from Manila that it has never seen in any decorated champion it could have approached at any point in the past several decades? The answer to all of those questions is the same answer, and it is the answer this entire story is built around. Wertheimer didn't go to Paris to invest in a ranking. He went to Paris because he had spent 60 years building a brand around the idea of aspiration. Around the idea that luxury at its most powerful is not about what you own. It is about how something makes you feel. It is about whether you see yourself in it. Whether it speaks to something real in you. And what Alex does, every single time she walks onto a court with those Philippine flags rippling through the stands and those chants rolling across the stadium, is make millions of people feel seen in a space that was not built with them in mind. That is aspiration in its most essential form. And that, to an 85-year-old man who has spent his entire professional life understanding desire, was worth more than any Grand Slam title on a resume. But let's go back even further because the Chanel meeting and the ticketing crash and the emergency meetings in the administrative offices of Roland Garros are all consequences of something that started much earlier and much more quietly. They are the downstream effects of a story that begins not in Paris but in Manila, with a 12-year-old girl making a decision that most adults would hesitate to make.
She left home.
Left her family, her language, the neighborhood she had grown up in, the daily rhythms of life in the Philippines, and flew to Mallorca, Spain to join the Rafa Nadal Academy. The academy is not a comfortable place. It was never designed to be. The philosophy at the center of it was built by a man who became the greatest clay court player in history, not because he was the most naturally gifted of his generation, but because he was willing to go further into discomfort than anyone else was willing to follow. The drills are relentless. The standards are uncompromising. The culture rewards the player who keeps working when every reasonable instinct in their body is telling them to rest. For a 12-year-old arriving from Manila, landing in a Spanish academy without her family close by, the adjustment was enormous by any measure. And yet she absorbed it. Every lesson, every philosophy, every demanding standard. She built herself inside that system and she emerged from it as something specific and identifiable. A player with an aggression and a pace and a mental composure that her opponents consistently underestimate until they are on the wrong end of it. Fast forward through those years of formation and we arrive in Miami, which is where the wider world first had to take her seriously. She came in as a wild card, ranked outside the top 40, the kind of player who fills out the early rounds of a draw before the seeded players take over. And then she started winning. Not surviving. Winning. She beat Grand Slam champions.
She kept going.
She reached the semifinals of a WTA 1000 event as a wildcard, and by the time the results were going up on the board, the tennis world had that particular expression it gets when something doesn't fit into the categories it normally uses to organize itself. But the most significant reaction to Miami did not happen inside the tennis world. It happened across the Pacific. It happened on screens in Filipino homes and in GFW group chats and in the WhatsApp messages flying between diaspora communities scattered across a dozen countries. Because what those communities saw in Miami was not just a tennis result.
It was evidence.
Evidence that the distance between where the Philippines sat in global sport and where a Filipino woman could actually go was not as permanently fixed as the previous decades had suggested. And once a community that has spent years watching a sport from a distance suddenly sees itself reflected at its highest level, something shifts that does not shift back. The Miami run was followed by a WTA final at Eastbourne.
A title in Guadalajara.
A semi-final at the ASB Classic to Open 2026. A career-high ranking of 38, making her the first Filipino tennis player ever to break into the WTA Top 50. Each result landed differently in the Philippines and in Filipino communities around the world than it did in the tennis analytics community. For the analysts, it was a data series. For the diaspora, it was something else entirely. It was accumulating proof that one of their own belonged in rooms that had never been designed to include them. And the response to that proof was not passive.
It was physical.
It traveled. Which brings us to what happened in the weeks before the French Open began, because the ticketing crash and the secondary market explosion are really just the numerical surface of something far more human and far more moving than the spreadsheets in the Roland Garros administrative office could capture. In Manila, travel agencies reported a surge in Paris bookings unlike anything they had seen. Philippine Airlines added extra flights to meet the demand and those seats filled within hours of going on sale. The Department of Tourism was fielding calls from Filipinos across the world asking about visa requirements and accommodation and the most efficient way to get to Roland Garros from whatever city they happened to be living in. In Dubai, where more than 450,000 Filipino workers have built lives far from home, WhatsApp groups that normally organize carpools to work and arrangements for sending remittances back to families began organizing something different.
Travel schedules. Group rates for flights.
Meetings between people who had never met each other in person, but who shared a flag and a feeling and a reason to get to Paris. A woman named Maritz, a Filipino worker who had been in Dubai for 12 years, told a reporter that she had never taken a vacation. That every peso she earned was sent back home. But this year she was going to Paris. Her daughter had asked why. She said because Alex is playing. Because I need to wave our flag. Because I need to feel, just for a few days, like I belong somewhere. That single quote tells you everything that no tournament metric can. It tells you why this is not a sports story in the conventional sense. It tells you why the French Open organizers sitting in their windowless meeting room looking at their projections were right to sense that what they were dealing with was categorically different from anything they had managed before. It was not a fan base. It was a diaspora finding a reason to gather. People who had left the Philippines for nursing jobs in London and engineering roles in Canada and caregiving work in the Gulf and construction in Australia. People whose daily lives were defined by the particular loneliness of existing far from everything that originally shaped you, suddenly had a convergence point.
A court in Paris. A young woman from Manila.
A reason to be in the same place at the same time holding the same flag. The secondary market prices that alarmed the tournament officials, the €1,200 average for a first-round ticket, the speculative listings reaching €5,000 for a potential quarterfinal. Those numbers were not being driven by wealthy tennis enthusiasts with disposable income and a casual interest in an interesting young player. They were being driven by people like Meritz who had spent 12 years sending money home and decided that this particular trip was worth whatever it cost. And that is a completely different kind of spending decision. When you spend money you don't easily have on something that is not a luxury but a necessity, when the necessity is the feeling of belonging and being seen and being part of something that represents you on a global stage, the price becomes almost beside the point.
You find the money.
You make it work.
You go.
Inside the Roland Garros offices, tournament director Amélie Mauresmo sat at the head of a table surrounded by security chiefs, marketing executives, and ticketing managers, all of them processing a problem they had never had to think about before. The demand side of the equation was extraordinary. Over 85,000 queued online in the first few minutes. The official lottery crashed 3 times in the opening hour. Secondary market prices for a first-round match had exceeded the men's final. But the anxiety in that room was not about the demand. The demand was, in a purely commercial sense, extraordinary news. The anxiety was about what happened to all of that demand if Alex lost in the first round. Because the pattern had already shown itself at other tournaments. In Dubai, where her matches had boosted ticket sales by 48% year-on-year, the semi-finals and the final without her had lacked the same energy. The atmosphere had thinned. The magic had been specific to her presence and had not transferred to the rest of the event. Officials from Indian Wells had been even more direct about it, noting simply that Filipino fans paid when Alex played.
Not before, not after. When?
That pattern, applied to a Grand Slam where thousands of people had spent money they didn't easily have on the premise of her being in the draw and advancing through it, created a very specific kind of institutional anxiety. The tickets were sold. The money was in the bank. But the atmosphere, the electricity, the particular quality of experience that had made Roland Garros 2026 the most anticipated edition of the tournament in recent memory, that was entirely contingent on a 20-year-old performing well enough to stay in the draw. No tournament in the history of professional tennis had ever had quite that problem before. Not for a player ranked 38th in the world. Not for someone in a first-round match. And then the match actually happened. And everything the officials had been quietly afraid of turned out not to matter at all, because what Alex did on court Philippe Chatrier that morning made every contingency plan and every anxiety projection feel slightly beside the point. The roar that greeted her when she walked out was not a crowd noise. It was something more total than that. It was the sound of thousands of people who had traveled enormous distances and made genuine sacrifices arriving at the moment they had been moving toward. The nurses who had taken days off work they couldn't afford to miss. The engineers and caregivers and construction workers who had drained savings accounts and submitted leave requests and left their families temporarily behind. The grandmothers and the children and the young women who had never been to a Grand Slam before and may never get to come back to one again. All of them in the stands together. All of them holding the same flag. The Philippine colors were everywhere. Every tier of the stadium had clusters of blue, red, and white. The chanting started before the warm-up was finished and it did not stop. Alex was nervous early. Her first few games were tentative in the way that any player is tentative when the weight of the moment is pressing down from all directions. But the crowd did something that crowds are not always able to do for an athlete who is feeling that weight. It didn't add to it. It absorbed some of it. The chanting kept rolling in waves and somewhere in the rhythm of it, somewhere in the physical reality of being surrounded by thousands of people who had given so much just to be there, the tension began to ease.
She broke serve.
The stadium erupted in a way that suggested everyone in it had been waiting for that specific moment. She held to love and the flag started moving faster in the stands like the crowd could feel the shift and was responding to it in real time. The first set went to her 6-4. When the score went up, the sound was something that the historic old stadium had not heard in quite that key before. The second set was harder. Her opponent was a seasoned professional who had competed at Grand Slams for a decade and was not going to be overwhelmed by atmosphere alone.
She pushed back.
She extended rallies, forced deuce after deuce, refused to allow the match to slip away from her without a fight. And in those moments when it was genuinely uncertain, when the outcome could have gone either way, Alex reached for something that the Nadal Academy had spent years building into her. The refusal to stop. The muscle memory of discomfort. The deep cellular knowledge that the other side of the hard moment is always worth getting to. She won the final point on a forehand winner that landed flush on the baseline. Her opponent had no answer for it. Alex went to her knees on the red clay. Her racket was raised. The tears came freely and the stadium went somewhere beyond noise. In the stands, a grandmother who had traveled from Lyon and had been holding her flag for the entire match wept quietly and said to no one in particular, "She did it for us.
She did it for us."
And that sentence is the whole story really. Not the $45 million from Wertheimer, though that matters. Not the ticketing crash, though that is remarkable. Not the secondary market prices or the emergency meetings or the broadcasting numbers or any of the metrics that the tennis establishment uses to try to quantify what Alex has become. The whole story is in a grandmother holding a flag in the stands of Roland Garros, saying she did it for us. Because what Alex has done,